let's begin. This class is not about coming into your womanhood. This class is not about reclaiming some long lost form of divine femininity. This class is not about embracing fertility as your only purpose in life. Periods are not the same as womanhood. Periods are not the epitome of neo-spiritual feminine energy. Periods are not a sign of our only purpose in this life. My intent is not to give you another biology lesson like the ones you've already had in school. But if this class leads you to reclaim a part of your biology, then that's awesome. My intent is to give you the class you wish you had had in school. My intent is not to force you to think of your periods as magical from now on, but if this class leads you to reclaim your menstrual magic, then that's amazing. My intent is to invite you into the menstrual mysteries that the ancients already knew. My intent is not to tell you how you are supposed to feel every single day, but if this class leads you to become more mindful of how you feel, then that's amazing. My intent is to show you what to look out for and how to read your own body wisdom. And if this class does nothing else for you except this one thing, then I'm happy. I'd like you to remember that living a cyclical life is quite literally an active rebellion against the patriarchal capitalist paradigms in which we live today. Just by honoring and following our own inner and outer natural cycles, we're already fighting back. So maybe we'll be able to see our menstrual cycles not as a biological burden or as some God-given sign of our inferiority, but rather as the source of our inner power and as a war cry in this fight to reclaim our humanity. Well, why do we do this? Because Clarissa Pinkola Estes already taught us to be spiritual is not to leave the world, but to come close. So I'm asking you to come close today. Come close down into your body and root into this world. Take whatever resonates and leave whatever doesn't. Please stay open. Change whatever needs to be changed. I ask only one thing, that you have an open heart and an open mind. Because we will deconstruct, we will reclaim, and we will learn to embody. So to start with this, one little reflective question is usually a good, idea at this time. Think back to your very first period, the very first time you had your period. What was that experience like? This is reflective for you. When did it happen and how did you notice? What were you doing at the time? Who was with you? How did it make you feel? Who, if anyone, did you tell about it and how did they react? Who, if anyone, taught you about what was going on? And what did they teach you? Maybe you had no one to explain it all to you. Maybe you had a parent who got you pads and tampons and showed you how to use them. Maybe you had to endure some form of punishment because you started bleeding. Maybe you had to sit through a really embarrassing lecture on sex and the devil. Maybe you had a wonderful initiation ritual with your elders. Or maybe you had a very similar experience to mine. My mom meant well, but she did say, "Oh, welcome to womanhood." Little did she know that for the next 10 to 15 years or so, I was gonna forever equate my womanhood with pain because I was suffering from menstrual cycle cramps every freaking month. But it was stuck in my head, this womanhood idea. It has to be painful to be a woman. So I'd like to share an exercise with you around this topic. Next time you start your period, think about your very first time you had your period again. If you could go back in time, what would you tell your younger self at the time? How would you support them? What would your younger self like to do and what would she like to know? And how would you celebrate with her? So I invite you to do this every time you bleed, or definitely the next one you bleed. And also share this practice with someone you love or have close by who bleeds. Because it's okay to give yourself some love in that time too. And that's already the first stage of dismantling shame from our bodies. Ooh, we have a period started today. Perfect. So the bleeding wisdom is gonna flow. So yeah, this kind of shame around our bodies definitely also relates to our periods. It's this toxic tool of the patriarchy that is really closely connected to the period blood and menstrual cycles in general. And I would like to show you how, if you're open to it. Have you ever been called crazy or hysterical? That whole thing started roughly 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. That's when the term hysteria was first coined by Greek philosophers. Hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera, and it described a wandering womb, a condition which was thought to be caused by a free-floating uterus. The idea was that the moon had such a strong pull on the womb that it could block passages to the heart and lead to madness in women. Hippocrates was even one of those, and Aristotle too, who both believed that the wandering womb was a physical symptom of bad humors in women. These beliefs were also perpetuated by the Roman Empire. Pliny the Elder, the Roman author, naturalist, and philosopher who wrote the Natural History in the 1st century CE, claimed that period blood was dangerous. Of course, the Abrahamic religions had something to say about menstruation too. The Talmud, which is rabbinic law, as well as the Christian Bible, both considered periods to be dirty and polluting, and they each excluded women from participating in rituals and forbade them from joining any social activities. Then, by the onset of the Middle Ages, especially in Europe, menstruation was seen as a sign of a woman's sinfulness and a punishment for the original sin. Any related maladies, such as cramping or mood swings, were considered just a normal part of this punishment that we have to endure. By the end of the Middle Ages, then, as we were in the middle of the burning times all over Europe, menstrual health took another major hit. The burning of all heretics and witches and healers left the continent in dire need of home healers and herbalists. As a result, we see women pushed out of the early Christian medical schools in the following centuries, as the healing arts were now suddenly synonymized with battlefield medicine practiced by men alone, instead of home healing with herbs and holistic remedies that was practiced by witches and herbalists. And even during the Renaissance, then, 16th and 17th centuries, when the first autopsies on women showed that a uterus cannot actually move around the body, ideas around hysteria didn't really change much. While from then on, it wasn't considered a physical condition any longer. The narrative simply changed a little. Now hysteria was a mental illness that could only affect women. Beliefs around menstruation remained negative. Having a period was still medically described as dangerous and a debilitating condition. And Paracelsus, for instance, a famous alchemist and natural philosopher of the 16th century, even wrote that hysteria is caused by women's sexual depravity. So you can kind of imagine how the story continues, right? It just keeps getting worse. In the 19th century, then, female hysteria was an extremely common psychological diagnosis in people of all genders, but still predominantly in women, as they were believed to be naturally predisposed to mental and behavioral conditions. This widely held belief was heavily politicized, especially during the suffrage movements in the 1840s and during the first Women's Rights Convention in the US in the 1850s. At the turn of the century, then, Sigmund Freud further developed ideas around hysteria by adding the dimension of repressed sexual desires to the mix. This, in turn, was politicized again during the campaign for women's rights to vote in 1918 in the UK and 1928 in the US. It wasn't until 1980 that the American Psychiatric Association stopped diagnosing hysterical neurosis as a mental health condition. The 1980s. I know I was born in the 80s. in the 1970s still, there was this quote that I found: raging hormones make women unfit for public life, work, and even motherhood. Our hormones make us unfit for motherhood. That's how far we had come with that whole hysteria idea. So to sum this all up, we're just barely now coming out of 2,500 years of pathologizing periods, equating our cycle with womanhood, and in turn making womanhood itself symptomatic. All while doing nothing to actually support people with periods to live healthy and happy lives. Modern research of PMS, its causes, and potential cures did emerge from this history of hysteria, but even here, the lingering idea that it's all just in our heads kind of stays in society like this festering little tumor. You can hear it pop up every now and again. Ah, it's just in your head. You're imagining things. So with all of this, a valid question is, are women and folks with periods mad? Are we bad? Or are we just really angry? Because while the diagnosis of hysteria is no longer recognized in modern medicine, its legacy persists in the form of stereotypes and stigma around our emotions and menstrual cycles in general. There is a large gender health gap that only widens further when we take skin color into account, or even other gender expressions. And anyone with a uterus still faces ridiculous levels of medical gaslighting. And that's just for female gender affirming care. I think we're all well aware of what happens to people who do not identify as females but still have a uterus and bleed. Some examples. Birthing has become the most medicalized and unnatural process of our time, even downright life-threateningly dangerous for our Black and brown sisters. Our cycles are being regulated away with artificial hormones. Period cramps are still considered normal, so much so that some European countries are even debating whether or not to introduce the federal menstrual leave for employees with periods. As if we need sick leave. Our modern hormonal birth control pill was first tried and tested on completely unwitting Puerto Rican women who had no idea what they were even taking, let alone then later able to obtain it when it was finally FDA approved and released. Sexual freedom for some on the backs of many, feels like. Young children with female genitalia are still horrendously butchered in the name of religion and societal norms all over the world. Period poverty is skyrocketing, even in the Western world. The pink tax is real, and the call for free period products is widely countered with an exacerbated, don't be ridiculous. Serious conditions such as endometriosis and PCOS are treated with hormonal birth control or even complete hysterectomies. And that's if they even get diagnosed. It still takes on average 10 years to get a diagnosis for endometriosis, for instance. By that time, then it's usually too late to save the uterus anyways. Dietary tips, health indices such as the BMI, workout regimens, supplements, all of those tips that you can find everywhere. Most of this research is still primarily done on male-only test groups. Women are treated simply as small men. Just think 2023 marks the year that we created the first female anatomy crash test dummies for cars. Crash test dummies with boobs, because that seems to make a difference. In some ways, I'd even say the pendulum has swung the other way, still within the same limited box of binaries. Nowadays, we simply treat women as small men in a lot of the cases. And while on the one hand, female biology and womanhood has been used against entire groups of people, in other areas of life, we simply pretend that it doesn't exist at all. That seems convenient. Not only is the modern world not designed for us, it's also still dangerously not informed enough about how to help us when we actually need help. So before we go into the reclaiming part, maybe let's take a deep breath, because then I would like to turn us onto the path of the reclamation. Because as Dr. Gabo Mate says, healing is the journey to wholeness. So let's get to reclaiming everything. Here's a huge reminder for you. Your first period is not just an initiation into womanhood. No matter how much the turfy, divine feminine group of sort of beige Instagram accounts will have you believe it is. Because listen closely to their argument. They often boast about the excruciating pains and struggles they endure due to being a woman. And they wear their hardships and physical ailments as a badge of honor that distinguishes them from men. And while technically these physical experiences are all valid in their own right, if you really listen, you'll kind of hear the underlying pain, the original sin pain, the God is punishing me pain, the I deserve this pain. Their badge of honor suddenly reveals its true face, the symbol of religious and societal heteronormative oppression that it actually is. So let's find compassion for them too and work towards healing our relationship with this very natural body function instead of forcing more meaning onto it than is absolutely necessary. Because your first period really is an initiation, but not just into womanhood. How limiting. Rather, it's an initiation into an entirely new phase of life. This new archetypal energy that comes at the transition from the maiden to the wild woman archetypes. So if we think of our first period as an initiation, we can think of it as an initiation into the life, death, and rebirth cycle of nature all around us. That's what we're being initiated into. That's bigger than womanhood. So much more, right? So let me tell you the story of Vasilisa, the beautiful, and Baba Yaga, the old witch. Once upon a time, there was a young girl named Vasilisa whose mother died suddenly. With her dying breath, her mother gave Vasilisa a little doll and the words, I leave you this little doll. When you need help, give it food. It will help you in all your troubles. The doll will tell you what to do. After the father remarries, Vasilisa has to live with a stepmother and stepsisters. I think we know another version of that tale. And one cold winter day, her stepmother sends her on a dangerous mission out into the woods, hoping that she wouldn't return. So Vasilisa embarks on her journey and eventually, thanks to the doll's help, comes to the hut of Baba Yaga. Crazy witch. The witch demands that Vasilisa perform impossible tasks, but with the help of her little magical doll, Vasilisa succeeds every time. At some point, Baba Yaga then asks Vasilisa the famous riddle of the black, red, and white riders. Vasilisa correctly identifies the black rider as representing the night and death, the red rider as sunrise and rebirth, and the white rider as day and life. Impressed with Vasilisa's bravery and resourcefulness and intimate understanding of this life, death, rebirth cycle, Baba Yaga gives her the light of the fiery skull and allows her to return home. And so Vasilisa uses the fire to transform her life and free herself from her abusive stepfamily. This story of Vasilisa and Baba Yaga teaches us about the importance of a proper initiation into our intuition and body wisdom. She teaches us not to be afraid of the non-rational and to trust in the never-ending cycle, both around us and inside us. And that story is also why I named the app, the cycle coaching app, Baba Yaga, because I wanted to bring that witch energy back as a benevolent force, complete with initiation rituals and magic around it. So I have another invitation for you. Please go and look up wherever you're at or whatever lineage you're from, your ancient practices, your ancestry's ancient practices around menstruation. You will be able to find some cool stuff, I promise. Because there is so much rich cultural history and spiritual ritual to explore all across the pre-Abrahamic world. I'll give you a few pointers in a sec. It's a good question. I started on the research last fall also, and I still haven't really found an ending to it. Every time I have a thought or an idea again, I will, double check it, and this will just lead me down rabbit holes all over the place. Some of the rituals I found and stuff that you could look up specifically when you Google where you're from, where you're at currently, in what sort of land, on what land you're on, or what your lineage, your family, cultural history is. Definitely check for the pre-Christian heritage, and then try to look up these types of rituals. Anything around menstrual huts, red tents, and sweat lodges. Yoni steams, herbal remedies, and womb massages are things to look for in combination with your location or your ancestry. Anything around psychic journeying, oracle card readings, and healing. Pelvic muscle exercises to train ourselves to free bleed and to practice active release. That's something I found quite useful. And then also all types of practices around fertilizing your plants and crops with menstrual blood. That's definitely something that happened in a lot of pre-Christian cultures. So those are some of the pointers that you can start looking for. And now, before we can reclaim the spiritual and energetic aspects of menstruation, I feel like we kind of have to bust a couple of the biological myths. So let's do that quickly. What is the cyclical nature we keep hearing and talking about? There are two types of cycles we live by: the circadian and the infradian rhythms. The circadian rhythm is the 24-hour sun cycle. It's responsible for regulating many of our physiological and behavioral processes, such as some of our hormone production, body temperature, and alertness. The entire Western world operates on this daily cycle that follows the sun. The workday, for example, was created to accommodate the daylight hours in the day, right? Infradian rhythms are biological rhythms that occur over a period of time, usually longer than 24 hours, typically weeks, months, or even years. This is the 29-day lunar cycle, for example. These rhythms also influence various physiological and behavioral processes, such as hormonal changes, environmental cues, and our social interactions. Our menstrual cycle is one such infradian rhythm. Other examples might be hibernation patterns in animals, or migration in birds, and the annual breeding cycles of many species. In humans, seasonal affective disorder, for instance, is a type of infradian rhythm disorder that affects mood and behavior during the winter months. So we can already see how our cycle is so much more than just a sign of fertility. While yes, a healthy cycle is an indicator of our fertility, it's also so much more. Because virtually everything you've ever been told about the menstrual cycle is wrong. I'll give you 3 facts and we'll bust them, or 3 myths and we'll bust them with facts. Number 1, your menstrual cycle is not just your period. Even though a lot of people say things like, I'm on my cycle, what they probably mean is they're on their period. If you have a uterus, then you have a cycle, and you're always on your cycle. The period is just one part of that entire cycle. So we start counting a new cycle on the first day of our period, and the last day of the cycle is just that last day before your next period starts. Myth number 2, sort of, or idea number 2. Maybe you remember the graphs with hormone curves from health class or all over Instagram. Usually those show a regular 28-day long cycle with a 5-day period and an ovulation on day 14. And almost everything about this is statistically speaking absolutely a myth. The worldwide average menstrual cycle length is actually 29.3 days, which is kind of exactly like the lunar cycle, which is 29.5 days. Healthy periods can be between 3 and 10 days long and are completely arbitrary in a way. There is no correct period length. There is no normal period length even. It's always about asking about a healthy period. That can be anywhere between 3 and 10 days. Ovulation doesn't usually occur on the same day every cycle for everyone. And it would be dangerous to assume that it happens smack in the middle of a cycle, like in these graphs on day 14, especially if you're using cycle tracking as a contraceptive. or if you're having a hard time getting pregnant. Assuming that ovulation is just always on the same day is just not a good idea. One of the biggest mistakes, or one of the biggest myths we mistake for fact, is actually that people with a uterus are fertile every day of their cycle. And that's just simply not true. We have more and less fertile days, and we have completely infertile days in our cycle. But we're definitely not fertile every single day. So putting the birth control burden entirely on people with a uterus is kind of not justified at all. And then add to that the current political climate in the US, for instance, where conservatives are essentially aiming to keep us as mis and downright uninformed about our own bodies as possible. They're even restricting menstrual education in middle schools now. This is why it is an act of rebellion to learn about the menstrual cycle, to understand bodies with a uterus, and to spread education and access as far and wide as we can. And technically, even the term menstrual cycle is a little bit misleading, because even though on the surface, menstruation is the only directly observable symptom of our cycle, it's just not the whole story. In fact, bleeding once a month alone is not even considered a period. It's only a real period if it's also triggered by a healthy ovulation. The thing is, you don't even have an ovulation at all if you're, for instance, on hormonal birth control. The bleed that you experience in between pill packets isn't considered a period. It's just a drug withdrawal bleed. Because it's important to note that hormonal birth control is medication, and it is medication that represses or suppresses ovulation. So please keep that in mind also later when we look at the cycle phases. What it really should be called is an ovulatory cycle, because it's ovulation that runs the show. It's ovulation that determines your period, it's ovulation that determines your cycle length, and it's ovulation that determines your fertility. Ovulation also influences our general health positively. Bone density, blood sugar levels, skin and hair health, lower risk of PCOS. When we ovulate, type 2 diabetes risk is lower. Endocrine health in general. You can see why the ovulatory cycle is considered the fifth vital sign in people with a uterus. Your body is basically constantly sending you signals as early health indicators. The most significant ones are basal body temperature, cervical mucus, and cervical position. That is what this whole fertility awareness thing is all about. These signals are directly related to your estrogen and progesterone levels and are important in your general health as indicators. So how do we embody all of that? It's nice to have this theoretical knowledge, but now what do we do? How do we embody all of this reclamation work? Our menstrual cycle can be a connection to our body wisdom, our inner clock. But again, not in the way that you think. It's not just a clock for baby making. How limiting. I want to invite you to move into the idea of the energetic menstrual cycle, because as important as it is to observe the moon phases and the seasons and our cosmic guidance in the shape of astrology, for instance, we can't forget this. As above, so below. As without, so within. You carry a mirror of the moon, the seasons, and the stars inside of yourself. Never forget this. You probably know in this group, I assume you know very well about the moon phases. And if we look at our menstrual cycle as a mirror of that, then we can also look at our menstrual cycle phases like the moon phases. Your inner new moon is the start of your menstruation. When it's the waxing crescent into full moon phase, that's the follicular phase. That's what's usually called the follicular phase. The full moon point is then your ovulation, whenever that happens.